Hello, everyone. It's still morning, so good morning. I'll wait, some people are filtering back in. Those of you that attended the conference here in 2011 are familiar with the term crossover artist. It's an artist that moves from one medium into another, and Bullseye has always been interested in these particular artists that are going to come into this material that we all know so well and bring fresh eyes and fresh ideas to it. And myself being a crossover artist, originally a painter and now working in glass, I think a lot about this translation of material, almost like learning a new language. That what we want to say usually at the beginning remains the same, but the way in which we get there, the way in which we conjugate those verbs changes. And eventually, as we become more familiar with that, with the way in which we want to say these things, that then what we want to say changes. So I had the privilege of working with James Thompson this last fall and also again in the spring as he went on this path of learning the language of glass. And the first thing that I noticed as we started to seriously work together is that after the first few days, I was basically just there to turn the kiln on. Because James's understanding of color went across the materials of paint, printmaking, and glass. His keen understanding of the sophisticated, tiny, minute changes in color was already there. So he didn't need me there to facilitate his vision. He had it. So it's really my privilege to introduce James Thompson, who is a professor of art at Willamette University in Salem, where he's been there since 1986. His most recent exhibition, Linear Metaphysics, Contemporary Mark Making and Time-Based Artworks, was at, I had to write that down because it's really long. It was at the Hallie Ford Museum. It just recently closed, but you can always look for his work as he exhibits all over the place, nationally and internationally. So please welcome to the stage James Thompson.
Thank you. Well, excuse me, these are my reading glasses. Thank you very much, and I think it's solstice, is it not? Great, because that's a critical day for human beings for tens of thousands of years, really, and having done a lot of work in Scotland and the UK recently in terms of looking at archaeology and fragments in time, and geological time, and stone, and marks, and soil, and dust. The Druids are out today. I'm sure they're at Stonehenge, and they're up there in Scar Bray, and they are all over. And it's a great pleasure to be here on solstice. I want to thank Bullseye immensely for having me here, for allowing me to work with a material that I had absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever, except the glass that contained wine in my hand. And that was about it. So what I'm going to do is tell you some stories today about color, but it's not about really artistic color in any way. It's about color that has this kind of great beauty and mystery and terror to it in terms of how it came about for us as human beings. So I'll read you some of this paper, and then we'll kind of jump into my work just toward the end, because I think the stories have a great deal of meaning to them, and I encourage you all to look at some of the books that were listed in your packet, because I'm not telling you anything new here at all. I'm just kind of putting this together for you in a way that I hope you find interesting, and I hope you find in a way mysterious and also very funny. So I want to start right away with this, and let me get my little clicker here. Okay. I'll begin with some medieval advice on the long, arduous task of mixing ultramarine blue from the author of the Craftsman's Handbook, Cennino Cennini. Keep it to yourself, for it is an unusual ability to know how to make it properly, and know that making it is an occupation for pretty girls rather than for men, for they are always at home, reliable, and they have more dainty hands. Just beware of old women. So what you have here is my grandmother, Kate Mshuskis, Lithuanian, And the color I remember her in is always white. Hugh Aldersley Williams says in his book, Periodic Tales, A Cultural History of the Elements, From Arsenic to Zinc, which is a lovely book to read. Seeing these vivid cadmium paints forces me to consider how hard it is to describe colors at all. Our vocabulary of color is severely limited. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet doesn't begin to cover it when the average eye can discriminate several million tones. Scientists use a particularly dodgy sounding unit, just noticeable difference, as a measure of this magnificent human capacity. These 7 colors of the rainbow tell us less about color than they do about our laziness when it comes to naming of it. Global brands like BP and Coca-Cola cling to these primaries because it is easier to defend ownership of them than subtle in-between shades from which there is no agreed word. Beyond this, there is no language of pure color. All we can do is adapt qualifiers, light, dark, green, dull, greenish, and so on, or seek likenesses in things that characteristically have the color we are trying to describe. These may come from nature, primrose, say, or kingfisher blue, and sometimes they come directly from the elements themselves, as with chrome yellow or cobalt blue. But correct interpretation depends on a shared cultural ground. Pillar box red is only that particular shade of red, or for that matter, red at all, if you live where the pillar boxes actually are red, and where, furthermore, everybody is familiar with them. More often, these terms are hopelessly vague. Sky blue, let's say, or one of my favorite colors from Bullseye is Oregon gray. And I appreciate Bullseye putting all the grays of Oregon into one gray. That is a marvelous feat. Or if not esoterically precise, such as artist paint called mummy brown, which fell rapidly out of fashion when people realized that it truly was made from ground-up Egyptian mummies. According to Chris Lee, in his article Mummy Brown, published in Cabinet's issue number 47, and if you don't read Cabinet, you should, because it's a fantastic magazine. It encompasses all sorts of different disciplines, artists, scientists. It's fantastic. I'm sure some of you do. By the 16th century, large shipments of mummies were already being received in London. The English merchant John Sanderson reported from his home in Cairo in 1586 on the sale of some 600 pounds of mummy parts to London's apothecaries, who, as Woodcock, that's the scholar Sally Woodcock, in her 1996 article, Body Color, the Misuse of Mummy, published in the Conservator, volume 20, number 1, points out had a close connection to the color trade at the time, suggesting that the material might well have been used to make both medicine and paint. And that's fantastic. Recipes for turning cadavers into color can be found from the 18th century on. Some argue that the finest color is produced by using the muscles and fleshiest parts of the mummy, while others advocate for grinding the whole body, bones, wrappings, and all, to create what one commentator called a charming pigment, uniting a peculiar grayness due to the corpse and its bandages to the rich brown tone of the pitch or bitumen. The trade boomed after Napoleon's occupation of Egypt in 1798, and artists continued to use the pigment until well into the 19th century, when a ban was created to stop the export of mummies from Egypt. Lee claims that while mummy brown could nevertheless occasionally be found in paintmakers' inventories into the 20th century, a note in the October issue of Time seems to have announced its final death. According to a short unsigned article by Geoffrey Robertson Park, then managing director of Robertson, leading paintmaking firm in London, regretfully admits that the firm has run out of mummies. We might have a few odd limbs laying around somewhere, and as an Englishman he apologized, but not enough to make any more paint. We sold our last complete mummy some years ago, I think 3 pounds. Perhaps we shouldn't have. We certainly can't get any more. Another peculiar brown, and we just saw some browns from Bullseye, we have difficulty in imagining, is the color puce. And forgive my French, because of having lived there for a month, I still forget it. I have trouble with the language. According to Barry Sanders in his article, Puce, published in Cabinets number 32, don't expect to find the answer in the Oxford English Dictionary, for it offers only the following thoroughly confusing definition of a flea color: purple-brown or brownish-purple. Does the OED deliberately deceive? Puce is not flea color. That would render the color black. And black is far from either brown or purple. The supreme arbiter of the English language only perpetuates the mystery. Sanders goes on to tell us how the flea took on its sexual identity from a string of suggestive cognates, with puce like pucelle, or maiden, and in certain contexts, slut, pucelage, maidenhead, or de pucier, to the flower. In addition, the French eroticized the flea in a phrase popular since the 14th century, avoir la puce l'oreille, to have a flea in one's ear, meaning that one harbors a libidinous urge, a sexual itch. Say the word puce today, and a Frenchman will either tither or give you a knowing wink. Sanders points out that the flea has served as a metaphor of love since antiquity, as in the volume of poems Commen de Pelouse, Songs of the Flea, which may have been written by Ovid or Catullus. In 1582, the cycle of poems composed by a group of distinguished men commemorating the flea witnessed by them one summer evening, nestled on the bosom of a young Mademoiselle Catherine Pasquier, was published with the title, La Puce de Madame de Rocher. The assembled gentlemen weren't certain whether or not they should pluck and kill the flea or simply make an attempt to ignore its enviable position. Sanders goes on to assert that most of the assembled gentlemen wanted to kill the flea, but stopped themselves, which takes us to the very dark heart of the joke. A flea's color does not change after it bites an animal or a person. The flea, both pre and post-bite, retains its jet black appearance. We can only enjoy the color puce, only experience it firsthand by killing. In order to spill our own artistic guts, we must first spill the flea's. And given its sexual connotations, we call pucelage and maidenhead, popping the flea reverberates with sexual innuendo, specifically with breaking the hymen. Puce is love's stain, not to mention the dangerous and deathly connotations associated with fleas and their spread of plague through the ages, which is quite an interesting painting for the CDC here. We all remember John Donne's 1633 sonnet, The Flea, in high school, in which the speaker describes the purpling of his mistress's nails after she kills the flea. French painter Georges de la Tour chose as a subject of his painting, The Flea Catcher, a woman in the act of killing a flea that is too infinitesimal for viewers to see, so we must trust in the title of the piece. Sanders tells us that all we can really see and what has been left behind in the painting is pure color. Latour has bathed the entire canvas in a purple-brown or brownish-purple, depending on how the candle illuminates parts of the background. The Flea Catcher, a radical painting in the history of art, takes on a bit of philosophical importance as well. For Latour, it destroys not just the animal, but also the sexual organs of that single, sneaky, most playful, and dangerous color, already a part of the French palette by Latour's time in La Color Puce. The flea is dead, out of the picture. Only the pure color remains, cleverly present in the painting's title, this time in the second meaning of puce. And that's the color we use today. Still elusive, still very playful, but decidedly now asexual. So puce is purple-brown or brownish-purple. Leave it to the French and the CDC to come together on that one. Though perhaps not quite this kind of purple. Prior to the invention of artificial or chemical aniline dyes, colors were produced by a variety of natural sources, such as rocks, minerals, metals, and of course vegetable materials in the form of plants. Plants and vegetable materials provided an enormous range of colors, but the human appetite for fashion, most notably in the 1800s, alongside the expansion of the cotton industry and increased trade abroad, fueled the desire for a wider range of hues and values in color dyes for clothing and other artifacts such as wallpapers, upholstery, drapery, book covers, and fabrics. Here's a chart indicating which British dye plants are used to produce certain natural colors. Note the foreign dyestuffs on the right-hand column, indicating what colors can be varied utilizing substances from outside the country's borders to increase the range of colors used by dye fabrics. And for the European who were colonizing, those materials from outside their borders were, of course, critical. The natural dyes in one country may well have varied significantly from the natural dyes in another country, thus providing a distinctive quality to the dress and possessions of the people of Great Britain versus those in India, for example. Until the advent of aniline dyes, that is, which have made accessible to many across the borders of the world, one type of purplish color which was invented that had an intensity so desirable and wonderful, except for Ted's pants there, to consumers that it changed the world altogether, and that was mauve. And this is Perkins' little original jar of mauve. How this happened was this. In the search for a treatment of malaria, chemist and aniline expert August Wilhelm Hofmann sought to chemically synthesize quinine. He had been experimenting with coal tar compounds, and one of the chemical derivatives of coal tar was aniline. In the mid-1850s, Hofmann gave one of his students, William Perkin, then 19 years old, the task of developing a synthetic form of quinine. Perkins set up a personal laboratory in the garden shed at his parents' home in Shadwell, East London, and from there launched the chemicals industry through his experiments. Using aniline as a starting material that oxidized and produced a black solid, he dissolved this solid, which most chemists would have thrown away, but for some reason he didn't, in methylated spirit, which produced a purple solution. Perkin dyed silk with this solution just because he wanted to try it. This is the fascinating thing about making things and failing all the time. You want to try again with this solution, and found it to be a stable compound which resisted the light and subsequently fading effects. This is how it looks today. And this is one of the original dresses dyed with mauve. These synthetic aniline dyes held their color for a much longer period of time than the colors produced by, of course, vegetable dyes. The range of colors available through these chemical dyes increased the palette dramatically. Furthermore, a few grams of this liquid dye was so intense that it could dye hundreds of yards of cloth, be it silk, cotton, linen, or wool. Mauve introduced a mania as the purple craze overtook Europe. Mauve offered an acceptable color for women who were leaving a period of mourning. Traditionally, full black mourning clothes, or what were known as widow's weeds, were adopted in Victorian England for a long period of time after the death of a family member. And there were plenty of deaths from cholera, pox, malnutrition, bubonic plague, and a host of infections. Mauve was one of the few colors women were allowed to wear after shedding the full black mourning attire. Therefore, mauve was a transitional color, a fluid color, with various levels of meaning in a dynamic period of time embracing change and expansion in England and Europe. A veritable explosion of industrial color occurred shortly thereafter as the desire for fashion and the hunger for a wider range of hues was evidenced. So you can see we're still asking Bullseye to produce more colors. Nothing new about that, because in the 1800s, people were starting to clamor for color. For example, according to Simon Garfield in his book Mauve, How One Man Invented a Color That Changed the World, in Germany in 1916, 8 companies formed a conglomerate to prepare for greater competition in the post-war market. That conglomerate was, of course, IG Farben, which included Agfa, Bayer, BASF, and Hoist. This syndicate, Garfield writes, instantly became the biggest chemical company in the world and would soon try to take it over. He also writes that at its peak in interwar years, IG Farben employed 120,000 workers, including 1,000 qualified chemists. Its dye trade accounted for about a third of its output. And although it did not produce the best new dye innovations in this period, that honor went to ICI, an English company, its huge expansion was due to its skilled marketing experience, especially as it switched from its closed European markets to the East. Garfield also writes that in 1916, Britain played a significant role in the establishment of the DuPont Dye Works, which Herbert Levenstein exchanging information on the production of indigo. Bringing the beauty and mystery and terror of color to the fore yet again, however, Philip Ball reminds us in his book Bright Earth, at no time has the demand for color fueled scientific advancement more than it did in the final decades of the 19th century. According to the historian of technology Anthony Travis, once dye making evolved into an expanding science-based activity, the modern chemical industry was born. Out of bright purples and lustrous reds, shocking pinks and brilliant yellows, emerged all that is good and bad in this most mercurial of modern technologies. Cures for devastating diseases, cheap and lightweight materials, mustard gas and Zyklon B, enough explosives to fuel 2 world wars and more, liquid crystals and ozone holes. In other words, the modern age. Meisel Taussig points out in his book, What Color is the Sacred, another fantastic book to read, that it was indigo, the Sanskrit-derived name nila, meaning blue, that provided the name for the substance in coal tar, aniline that spawned mauves, reds, yellows, greens, and blues, and with them modern chemistry. There was still another connection with indigo, since aniline was first discovered in the indigo plant 6 years before it was discovered in coal tar. And this is Newton's little drawing of his color chart, which does include indigo. Now you won't see it in color charts. I must add that it was Newton who forced me out of physics when I was in college because he invented calculus. Enough said right there. Indigo throughout the course of history has singly the most important dye in the world. From what we know thus far, indigo cultivation probably began over 5,000 years ago in India's Indus Valley. Excuse me. In the early 1500s, Europeans desiring a profit from exotic trade brought Indian indigo in their holds, whereupon it was marketed by Portuguese traders as dye. Woad was used in Europe primarily for dyeing wool, which was a plant, in other words. No, excuse me again. Woad was used in Europe primarily for dyeing wool the color blue, and European growers of the plant, which for a long time prevented the indigo dye from being profitably sold there. In fact, in England, lobbyists for woad were able to get indigo officially certified as poisonous, though it is not. And so it was banned until 1660. Victoria Findlay tells us in her book, Color, A Natural History of the Palate. In Britain, the law was cheerfully defied, and from at least the 1630s onward, as the gentlemen of the East India Company made sure the dyers of blue were amply supplied with a legal Indian import. Woad is fine for coloring wool, people found, although adding Asian indigo to the woad vat resulted in a cheaper and stronger color. But to dye the cotton that was now beginning to arrive from India, dyers realized the most certainly needed the stronger vat that came from the imported indigo. Most blue vats in Europe still, in fact, are a mixture of two plant extracts. She continues, by the late 17th century, woad was mainly out, and indigo was very much in. Finley is keen to point out, indigo is a crop that has evolved a great deal of misery, because it is usually relied on to produce with forced labor. In the West Indies, this meant slaves. Jenny Balfour Paul tells us in Indigo that from the middle of the 17th century, the French and the British also established in the West Indies extensive plantations for indigo as well as for sugar, coffee, and cotton. All relied increasingly on imported slave labor. She reminds us that the French production of indigo escalated in the 18th century. Records show that San Domingo had no fewer than 3,150 indigo plantations by the 1780s, produces hundreds of tons of dyestuff annually. Indigo is among the key commodities arriving in the ports of Bordeaux and Marseille, destined both for the expanding textile industries of France and for re-export. French supplies of indigo dried up during the American Revolution, and the British supply routes were disrupted when the American colonies were lost, a situation that forced the British government to return to India for indigo to supply the textile industry. Balfour Paul tells us that in the 19th century, Bengal, and later Bihar, and to its north, became the world's main source of indigo, which was by now in great demand to supply the textile industries of the Industrial Revolution and to dye many of the European armed service uniforms. Throughout the century, natural indigo was far more valuable than any other dyestuff, even the synthetic alizarin. Bengal's indigo production far outweighed that of the rest of the world, substantial as this was. Balfour Paul goes on to tell us that the East India's operations in Bengal were so successful that the company's Asian India imports into London jumped from 25,000 pounds in 1782, when most indigo came from America and the West Indies, to 4,368,000 pounds in 1795, the bulk of it from Bengal. By 1850, Bengal alone exported a staggering 7,650,000 pounds, over 3,500 tons of indigo, valued at around 6 shillings a pound. European planters were legally prevented from purchasing or leasing land adjacent to their factories, so Bengali peasants were contracted through corrupt middlemen to grow indigo at the expense of rice cultivation necessary for their subsistence. The peasants rarely benefited financially from growing indigo. Without a rice crop to cultivate, they were in a state of permanent debt, so the system was deeply unpopular with them in an era of great famine and hardship. Our brief overview of indigo winds up with Balfour Paul noting that London's last dry salter to trade in natural indigo for commercial use sold his final chest of Bengali indigo soon after World War II. Natural indigo was still in demand elsewhere, as well as for local consumption. And for this reason, India still had almost 11,000 acres of land under indigo cultivation in 1955-56, producing 130 tons of dyestuff. But this talk is getting far too serious, so we'll give you this. This memorable image will help us seg into the next color with the origins on its production so mysterious as to create intrigue and wonder. The color is Indian yellow. We know that Indian yellow, in use since ancient times, was made in India because colormen received shipments of pigment nuggets at the London docks from Calcutta throughout the 19th century, with which they produced their pigment powders. Leading colormen of the day, Mr. Windsor and Mr. Newton, as well as George Field, turned these parcels into pigment powder. Likely beginning with the Dutch, the pigment was used by European painters from as early as the 15th century. Apparently, the nuggets had an unpleasant smell that led many to suspect they were derived in part from the waste or urine of animals. Some in the mid to late 19th century suspected snake urine, ox bile, caramel urine, the like, until a possible discovery was made. Victoria Finlay, in Color, A Natural History of the Palate, now writes, "Then one day in 1883, a letter arrived at the Society of Arts in London from a Mr. T.N. Mukherjee of Calcutta. This gentleman had investigated Indian yellow on the request of the eccentric but brilliant director of the Kew Gardens, Sir Joseph Hooker, and said that he could now confirm exactly what Indian yellow was made from. Mr. Mukherjee said he had recently visited the only place in India where it came from, a town called Munghai in the Bihar state, and had actually seen it being made. The information that he gave them may have been a little shocking to some of the journal readers, but what he told them was that India yellow, which was also known as piri, was made from the urine of cows fed with mango leaves and urinating on demand into buckets, which he swears he saw. And he warned the cows looked unhealthy and were said to die very early. None of this has been verified, and it seems difficult to believe that cows, considered sacred among Hindu people, would be maltreated in order to produce yellow pigment that winds up in London on painters' canvases. So I will leave you with this unsolved mystery to add to the beauty and terror of color. So that is my part one of telling stories for you about color. So I'll now go into some of my own work that this experience of working with glass was completely and utterly unique to me in all my years of being an artist, because glass has that peculiar thing that you got to deal with called light. And as a painter, I just worked with pigments, and I really wasn't too worried about light. And pigments allowed me to really, really alter and change consistently, inconsistently, fail, make again, throw out, try again, keep going on a series of works for many, many, many months. Because I generally work from a very general to specific kind of process in my work. And I have many paintings and many prints and drawings kind of going on simultaneously. I never just finish one. So when Bullseye asked me to come, the first time I ever came to Bullseye was to their showroom, and I about left because there was so much color and so much intensity and so much beauty that I was terrorized. I said, how does one choose? How does one know what to even choose when you have this in front of you? And you look in that place and you realize the greatness of what they've been able to do with this business called sand and fire, produce colors like these here. So when I began with Michael's class, painting with glass, which I took and subsequently came up to Bullseye last year a number of times just to play around, experiment, work with glass. And when I finally came back in November for the residency, I had ordered up a number of colors, these 12 by 12 inch panels and 24 by 24 inch panels to use. And I began to realize that the glass itself, the beauty of that particular color, was something I need to honor. So before I ever touched the glass, the yellows, the greens, the blues, the blacks, the whites, I needed to honor that somehow. But I didn't want that to control me as an artist. You know, I didn't want it to be overwhelming, so to speak. But believe me, when you're looking at glass as a painter and you're looking at paint, you get thrown off quite a bit. Things change a lot. And that's one thing I really liked about the glass itself. It changes. So I used, eventually, were these beautiful fine powders that Bullseye produces. And I had a whole assortment of them laid out, like about this many circles up here on the carpet in those containers you know of. And well, okay, let's get going. So I would sprinkle and sift and push around these powders, and for a good week or so, I kept doing this. Nothing was working, really. I didn't like anything that was really happening. Some of the work I did like, and this is one of them here, and this is the beautiful black, which is one of the greatest colors in the world to me, and this thing called steel blue, which they make. Great name for it. It's something that came close to my heart. I don't know why. I can't tell you. I'm very intuitive about color myself. And as I kept using it, I tried to control it a lot, which is a mistake. Don't do that. At least for me, it was a major mistake, because I was too specific, you see. And in the painting process, I don't have to be that specific because I know I can change things right away. So what I began to do was to sift the powders, and I'd put two squares together, and I could sift right over the middle of the two squares. And then I'd form this circle. For some reason, I was really intrigued with circles, because I'd been in Scotland and England for a number of occasions looking at prehistoric sites. Hill forts, circular mounds, the remnants and fragments of these prehistoric peoples, basically in the Neolithic period. And I was fascinated by that shift to farming that human beings did, because farming changed their whole cultural view, their whole cosmic view. They had to begin to look up and to notice when the light changed and when the light was the longest during a period of time. And they somehow had to make note of that in order to survive growing their food. So this circular, I digress, but the circular idea was in my head somewhere. So as I sifted these more and more, I realized that I could sift a teeny little bit, a nuance of other color, and fire it, and maybe fire it twice, and maybe fire it 3 times. But the great thing about Bullseye and working in this residency is that the professionals told me, now James, you got to be aware that if you go that high, you're going to lose it. I said, well, what do you mean I'm going to lose it? It's just going to melt, right? He said, yeah, but Ted would say, you got to back off. You got to be kind of conservative. And I'm not conservative when I paint. You know, it's just not in me. So I said, okay, we'll try this temperature versus this temperature. And I kept doing this, and I realized that this was starting to get some nice results for me, and I started to push my limitations more. So I pushed away a lot of colors I'd been experimenting with. And I began to just kind of gently sift these colors. And then I started to rake through it in these two that you see here with just a comb. And as I did this, I noticed that there was these peculiarities starting to come up on the surface, these little bits and pieces and fragments and differences, inconsistencies that were really part of my thinking about the peoples in the prehistory and how one in 21st century can understand the past. And that's really through transitory ideas and memory and fragments. So as I kept working, I realized with the powders that if I bumped the plate, so I knocked the edge of the plate, the perfect circle of powder would begin to separate and quiver and shake a little bit. I said, that's fantastic. I can't do that with a brush. I was trying to do things like that, brushes and sticks. It wasn't working. And so I kept bumping the plate, and the powders, which are glass, on glass, which is what I found really remarkable, because here's glass in color, and here's a powder which is also glass, but it's so different from the glass I'm looking at. So I had to figure out a way of pushing and maneuvering and somehow controlling, but not making the control so overwhelming and restricted. And there's a picture of me working on 3 of them there. And as I kept working on them, and of course you have to put them aside, fire them, wait the next day, which was kind of aggravating, because as a painter you don't usually wait too much. all right, next day, come back, do some more, pull out some more squares, keep working. And it begins to mount up. So I have all this in front of me, about less than 14 days or so, and I was getting a little more nervous and anxious because I'd kind of developed my techniques of hitting it and tilting it and letting the powders flow. But then I began, one of the things I could do, of course, I learned early on, is I could start to play around with this idea of adding a little bit of water, perhaps, or using a stencil into the powders. And I realized on this piece, the 24 by 24, that, as I said again, that beauty of the glass itself, the beauty of the color, the mystery of that color for me, but the intuitive sense that this is the color that can really work with a selected number of other colors. And very few, not many. I finally realized that this whole idea of working with glass was totally liberating for me, completely liberating. I was not confined anymore to being hesitant, nervous, terrorized by all the colors Bullseye had offered, or the millions of beautiful techniques they have to work with glass. You've got to make your failures. You've got to push yourself to a point, and I know it's expensive, to use those materials and not worry about the end result, the end product all the time. If you really want to try some things and make your own colors, let's say, you've got to experiment. And it's here where I began to really, in mud flats and others, play with the water and put some water in a certain spot on the glass in the powders, move it around, tilt it, let the water flow. So you're getting this flowing and this transition and this incompleteness and this either it's coming together or it's breaking apart at the same time. Then I could sift a little more powder and I could keep going and put it back in and fire it again. So there was, I think, one temperature at about 1240, I think, that was keen to all this. And as I kept going, I realized that this is the possibility. This is the beauty. This is the terror, and this is the whole mystery of it right here in front of me as I worked on it. I didn't need anything else. And I just kept going, kept continually shifting, making, pouring. Sometimes I would use a brush to cut into edges, to push away some of the powders. But the limitations is what opened everything up for me, gave me this freedom which I didn't have in the early stages of working with glass. And it's this kind of activity with a material and with color that I think that was for me the most liberating since I began as an artist really in college, when I realized that, one, I like working with my hands and I don't like calculus, and two, color and paint and materials and tools and experimentation is a lot like science. There's a lot of parallels, huge parallels, as you well know. And so the beauty of all this for me was simply, as I have to say over and over, was the opportunity, the chance. That is immense to me, and I'm eternally grateful for Bullseye with that, because as I was lifting a 2 by 2 foot piece of glass with the powder on it, trying to get it over to the lovely firing mechanism, there's that point where, James, if you drop this, you are in serious trouble. But then again, if you drop it, you might see how it looks on the floor. And then you might sweep up some of it. And, anyways, I digress sometimes, but you might take a picture of that and use it somewhere else. So it became this kind of interplay, which with the material, with the touch of it, with the shifting of it, with the firing of it, with asking questions from people at Bullseye who were, as I said, my great professional advisors besides Ted and Michael, which I have to say, in the end, made this lovely for me. And I am very happy to have been able to do this. And I hope to keep working with glass in different ways. So thank you very much.